Regardless of one's religious beliefs, the comprehensive impact of Christianity throughout human history is indisputable. Currently, over 2 billion people worldwide identify as Christians, constituting approximately one-third of the global population. Signs of Christian presence are evident in many aspects of daily life, from crucifixes on walls to Bibles on tables, local churches, imposing cathedrals, street names, artwork, music, statues, media productions, and online content. All these elements, in one way or another, relate to the central figure of Christianity, Jesus of Nazareth, or at least that's what is claimed. We will discuss the historicity of Christ based on non-Christian writers from the 40s AD to 200 AD. These include Cornelius Tacitus from 56 AD to 120 AD, Suetonius from 69 to 122 AD, Pliny the Younger from 61 AD to 114 AD, Lucian of Samosata from 120 AD to 180 AD, Celsus, who died in 178 AD, the Talmud from approximately 70 AD to 200 AD, and Mara bar Serapion from 73 AD to 200 AD. Cornelius Tacitus. Cornelius Tacitus is widely recognized in history as a governor of Asia and a prominent historian. He is revered as one of the greatest Roman historians. One of his major works is titled Histories, covering Roman events and occurrences between 69 and 96 AD, providing a valuable source on figures such as Galba, Otho, Vitellius, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. This book originally consisted of 20 volumes, of which only the first 4 have reached us, along with some fragments of the 5th volume. Another notable work by Tacitus is known as the Annals, his last and incomplete historical record. Initially, this book was divided into 30 volumes, and although it was written after the Histories, it deals with earlier historical events. Few copies of this book have survived to the present day, with one preserved in the Benedictine monastery of the Corvey Abbey and another at Monte Cassino. In this same book, we find an interesting quotation from Tacitus about the Christians.
But all human efforts, all the lavish gifts of the emperor, and the propitiations of the gods, did not banish the sinister belief that the conflagration was the result of an order. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular.
2 details are important to recognize. First, the term Tacitus uses to refer to the Christians was likely misspelled, as in Latin the text reads Christianos, and was later changed to Christianos, meaning Christians. Second, the name Christus was rendered in Latin only to demonstrate that Tacitus had clear information about the group of Christians he was writing about. As with all direct historical references to Christ, critics question the authenticity of this quotation since it closely resembles the information found in the canonical Gospels. There are some critical works regarding Tacitus's text that question the veracity of this expression. Among the statements, there's an assertion that there is a textual issue in the description of Jesus' death, whether it was merely a condemnation or crucifixion. Charles Dennis Fisher's text only expresses the extreme punishment, suggesting Roman death penalty, which typically would be crucifixion. However, it's possible that the term itself wasn't employed by Tacitus, as we attempted to demonstrate above. Nevertheless, despite this textual issue, the clear concept of Christ's death by Pilate during the reign of Tiberius still aligns with the scriptural description. It's also worth noting that he refers to Christ as a personal name, confirming the trend initiated in the New Testament to refer to Jesus Christ as Christ. It's also important to demonstrate that in Tacitus's view, Christ is the originator of a group of people called Christians, meaning he is the founder of the religious movement bearing his name. Yet another statement consistent with what we know from the scriptures. However, we need to pose an interesting question at this point. Could Tacitus's description be a late textual alteration promoted by Christians? This is a question raised by critics of the historical sources of Jesus Christ and deserves our attention. Our response to this question is no, for 2 reasons. First, if a Christian were to tamper with a text, they would likely suppress expressions about Roman hatred against them or the fact that they were considered a pernicious superstition. Second, the early church fathers made no use of this material from Tacitus anywhere, suggesting it wasn't of Christian interest, especially in the early centuries of Christianity when they didn't face difficulties with the issue of Christ's historicity. In other words, it's highly likely that the content of this quotation provided by Tacitus wasn't part of the early Christians' apologetic agenda and therefore wouldn't be available for tampering. It's an important testimony from a witness unsympathetic to the success and spread of Christianity, based on a historical figure, Jesus, crucified by order of Pontius Pilate. Gaius Suetonius. Gaius Suetonius was a Roman historian who should also be remembered in the research on the historicity of Christ. Little is known about him, except that he was the chief secretary of Emperor Hadrian, 117 to 138 AD. Suetonius holds a significant place in the history of historians due to his biographies of 12 Roman emperors, from Julius Caesar to Domitian, a work called De Vita Caesarum, probably written during Hadrian's reign. In this same work, we find at least two quotations of interest.
As the Jews were making constant disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he expelled them from Rome.
In this quotation, we find the expression Christus, another way of writing Christus, the Latin version of the Greek name for Christ. The authenticity of the quotation is plausible if it indeed refers to Christ, due to two important details. First, hardly would a Christian not place Christ in Rome around the year 49. And second, they certainly wouldn't dare to call him a troublemaker. It's also important to note that Suetonius's source is not a Christian, as it would be difficult to imagine a Christian misspelling the name of their savior. However, the more important question is, does Suetonius really speak of Christ? The question arises from the recognition that the name used by Suetonius was also known as a Greco-Roman name, besides the fact that it seems strange for Christ to be in Rome around 49 AD. Nevertheless, most historians seem to agree that this quotation contains a reference to Christ, as even the atheist Andrew Norman Wilson attested. Only the most perverse of scholars would doubt that Christus is Christ. The description doesn't seem to refer to a person per se, but to a title, which Suetonius probably heard without actually knowing. Another detail worth our attention is that the spelling here is very similar to that of Tacitus, another Latin writer. It was not uncommon for both the name of Christians and Christ to be misspelled in the 2nd century. Considering that it was historically common among Latin speakers to confuse the pronunciation of the name of Christians, it is not strange to think that the same mistake was made by Suetonius. Although the name Christus could be common in Greco-Roman culture, it is not found among the Jews in Rome during that period, according to what is known from inscriptions in the catacombs and other documents. Finally, we must consider another question. If Suetonius refers to Christ, wouldn't it be strange to think that Christ was personally in Rome, inciting a rebellion against Rome? The answer to this question is actually no. If the reference is indeed made to Christ, as a title and not as a person, it was not necessary for him to be there. As for Suetonius's second statement, it is less controversial. Nero inflicted punishment on the Christians, a group of people given to a new and evil superstition. It is likely that this new evil superstition refers to the early preaching about the resurrection of Christ. And what do we learn from Suetonius regarding the historicity of Christ? First, he relates the expulsion of the Jews from Rome, and also attests that Christ incited the Jews to cause disturbances in Rome, in addition to agreeing with Tacitus regarding the concept that the Christian faith had in the face of the Romans and beyond the normal use of the term Christian to refer to this faith. Pliny the Younger. Pliny is recognized as the governor of Bithynia in Asia Minor, 112 AD, during the reign of Emperor Trajan. Although he was a senator and prominent lawyer in Rome, his fame was ensured by his relationship with Emperor Trajan, to whom he wrote several letters, many of which survive to this day. His writing, very precise and commendable, led Pliny to be credited with inventing the literary style of the letter. Of the 10 books of letters known from Pliny, it is only in the 10th book, specifically in Letter 96, that we find something about early Christianity and Christ. Since it is assumed that these letters were organized chronologically, this statement is typically dated around 112 AD. In this letter, he speaks about the rapid growth of Christianity in the province of Bithynia, both in urban and rural areas. He describes the situation with abandoned Roman temples, pagan, in such a way that the business of those who sold fodder for sacrificial animals was affected. He also claims to have interrogated those who had been accused of being Christians and sentenced to death for it, to verify if they persisted in their assertion of being indeed Christians, as he himself states as follows.
This was the rule I observed in the case of those who were denounced to me as Christians. I asked them if they were Christians, and if they confessed, I asked them a second and third time, with threats of punishment. Those who persisted, I ordered to be executed, for I did not doubt that, whatever the nature of their creed, their stubbornness and inflexible obstinacy should certainly be punished. There were others possessed of the same folly, whom as Roman citizens I directed to be sent to Rome.
Pliny also speaks of people who had been accused of being Christians but claimed they were not, and the proof was their worship of the emperor's image as well as the imperial gods. He also demanded that these accused individuals curse Christ, something a genuine Christian would not be able to do. Regarding these supposed Christians, Pliny attests,
all of these worshipped your image and the statues of the gods and cursed Christ, yet they affirmed that their guilt, or error, did not extend beyond the custom of gathering on a fixed day before dawn to sing a hymn to Christ as to a god, of binding themselves by oath, not for the purpose of committing crimes, thefts, robberies, or adulteries, nor of breaking their word or refusing to return a deposit when called upon to do so. After these rites, it was their custom to separate and then reassemble to partake of food, but ordinary and innocent food. However, they had abandoned this practice after the issuance of an edict from you, according to your orders, which prohibited secret societies.
Pliny also mentions 2 female slaves who were considered ministers, in whom he found nothing but an irrational and boundless superstition. As a result, he suspended the investigation because he needed a specific opinion from Trajan, as he confesses.
The matter seems to me to warrant your attention, especially because of the large number of accused individuals. There is a multitude of all ages, of every rank and of both sexes who are or will be in danger, not only in the cities but also in the villages and countryside where the contagion of this superstition spreads. Nevertheless, I believe it is possible to curb and eradicate it.
In Pliny's remarks about early Christianity, terms very similar to those found in the writings of Tacitus and Suetonius are used. To him, Christianity was also a contagious superstition capable of corrupting Roman conduct. The authenticity of Pliny's letters is not contested, and therefore in them, we find another historical account of the historicity of Christ. Lucian of Samosata. Lucian of Samosata was a Syrian writer who wrote in Attic Greek, and in his works, he takes the opportunity to mock and satirize Christianity and its founder, Jesus Christ. Few details of his life are easily verifiable. In fact, his own words regarding himself are apparently controversial. He calls himself Syrian, Assyrian, and barbarian, which is understood as evidence that Lucian would be one of those residents of Samosata originating from the genuinely Syrian population and not Greek. In a work titled The Death of Peregrinus, in which he satirizes the life of Peregrinus Proteus, Lucian presents an interesting piece of information about Christ and the Christians.
The Christians, you know, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites, and was crucified on that account. These misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion which are so common among them. And then it was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers, from the moment that they are converted, and deny the gods of Greece, and worship the crucified sage, and live after his laws. All this they take quite on faith, with the result that they despise all worldly goods alike, regarding them merely as common property.
From this text, we can draw some conclusions that point to the existence of Jesus. Firstly, we are informed that Jesus was worshipped by the Christians. Secondly, it also informs us that Jesus initiated new teachings in Palestine. Thirdly, that he was crucified because of his teachings. Fourthly, Jesus taught his followers certain doctrines, such as that Christians are brothers. Fifthly, from the moment of conversion, and sixth, after false gods are denied, such as those of Greece. Additionally, these teachings included worshiping Jesus and living according to his laws. Lucian also refers to Jesus as wise. Celsus. Celsus was a 2nd century Greek Neoplatonist philosopher opposed to Christianity who wrote his main attack shortly after Lucian wrote The Death of Peregrinus. His work became known as the first written, among those we know today, to attack Christianity, the true word. His main thesis is to demonstrate that Jesus Christ was not of God, but at no point did Celsus attack the historicity of Christ. His work was preserved through the efforts of Origen, the Alexandrian theologian who dedicated himself exhaustively to answering the inquiries of Celsus, the anti-Christian. The book is called Against Celsus and is the only reference we have about his person. Furthermore, almost nothing is known about his personal life. What can be inferred from his work is that Celsus was well informed about 2nd century Christianity flourishing in Alexandria and Rome, interested in ancient Egyptian religions, and seemed familiar with Jewish doctrine of the Logos, suggesting that his work may have been written in Alexandria. Before delving into Celsus's statements, which are numerous and varied, it is important to present two related facts about this figure. In almost all cases presented so far, critics suggest occasions where late Christian interpolations are proposed, but this does not happen, nor could it, with Celsus's assertions. The level of attack and hostility towards Christ and Christians makes it impossible for it to be material adulterated by a Christian. Another recurring situation is the idea that ancient authors had Christians as sources, but this is not the case with Celsus either, especially since his writing presupposes a dialogue with a critical Jew, suggesting that his sources were not Christian, but possibly Jewish. It is worth remembering that Celsus's text was preserved by Origen, a Christian author, and it seems absurd to suppose that Origen would bother to adulterate the book he intends to respond to. According to Celsus, Jesus' ancestors came from a Jewish village, and his mother was a poor country girl who made a living as a seamstress. He performed his miracles through magic. He was physically unattractive and small. As far as he knew, Jesus observed all Jewish customs, including sacrifice in due time. He gathered only 10 followers and taught them his terrible habits, including begging and stealing. These followers, consisting of 10 sailors and tax collectors, were the only ones he convinced of his divinity, but now his followers have convinced multitudes. The news of his resurrection came from a hysterical woman, and belief in Christ's resurrection came from Jesus' magic, positive thinking from his followers, or mass hallucination, all for the purpose of impressing others and increasing the chance that others become beggars. Regarding the birth, life, and miracles of Christ,
Celsus, accuses Jesus of inventing his birth from a virgin and reproaches him as being born in a certain Jewish village, of a poor woman from his country, who made a living as a seamstress, and who was driven out of the house by her husband, a carpenter by trade, because she was convicted of adultery. After being driven out by her husband, and wandering for some time, she unfortunately gave birth to Jesus, an illegitimate son, who was employed as a servant in Egypt due to his poverty, and there acquired some magical powers, in which the Egyptians take so much pride, and, then, returned to his country, being exalted because of them, and through them proclaimed himself as a god.
The portrait that Celsus presents of Christ is far from fictional, an option he could have presented. However, what he does is present his version of the situation of Christ's birth by rejecting the concept of the virgin birth. The alternative proposal for Christ's birth, as an extramarital case of Mary, closely resembles a narrative already known in the Jewish Talmud, as we will see ahead. This indication favors the idea that not only were his sources non-Christian, but his preference for explaining what he hated was cynical, critical, and contemptible from the perspective of the gospel history. However, this proves the existence of Christ as a historical figure and not a mythological one. Regarding the incarnation of Christ,
and again, says Celsus, let us return to the subject from the beginning, with a greater range of proofs. I make no new assertion, but I say what has long been determined. God is good, beautiful, blessed, and this at the highest and most beautiful level. But if he descended among men, he must have undergone a change, and a change from good to evil, from virtue to vice, from happiness to misery, from better to worse. Who, then, would make such a choice of change? It is the mortal nature, indeed, to undergo alteration and transformation, but the nature of an immortal remains the same, unchanged. God cannot admit a change like this.
Celso demonstrates a rudimentary understanding of the Christian doctrine of the Incarnation, and he presents what, in his view, is an absurdity. The idea of change in God is so deplorable to him that it seems impossible to happen. Indeed, This is not what is defended in the incarnation of Christ, but the question he raises deserves our attention. Who, then, would make such a choice of change? In fact, what was proposed to Christ in the incarnation was not the change itself, but the implications of relinquishing his state of grace and exaltation with the Father, as well as the unrestricted use of his infinite resources and attributes, and being found in the form of a human servant to suffer in his sacrificial death, becoming sin for the sins of every individual from all ages and places. Who would do this? Only a loving God concerned with his creation would do this, and Jesus Christ did. About Christ and his disciples.
Jesus gathered around himself 10 or 11 people of notorious character, the most sickly of tax collectors, sailors, and with them he fled from place to place, and obtained his survival in a shameful and untimely manner.
In this statement, Celso confirms the fact that Christ invested in the discipleship of about 11 men, and he is also assertive regarding the profession they had. The disdain with which he presents this fact suggests that he truly believed in what he knew about Christ and the Christians. It is interesting that by doing so, he becomes an ancient witness to claims that the scriptures make about Jesus Christ. In another quotation, he makes further statements about Christ and his disciples, which also confirm interesting details presented by the scriptures. Observe.
He was abandoned and betrayed by those very people with whom he had associated, who considered him their teacher, and who believed that he was the Savior, the Son of the Most High God. Those with whom he associated while alive, who heard his voice, who appreciated his instructions as their teacher, upon seeing him subjected to punishment and death, did not even die for him but denied that they were his disciples.
Once again, Celso demonstrates his criticism against the figure of Christ as someone worthy of respect. After all, the only men who followed him and believed in his teaching are the same ones who deliver him to death and abandon him in this suffering. He also criticizes the stance of the Christians who are martyred for Christ, something his early followers were not able to do when their teacher was punished and killed. This statement, although full of cynicism, confirms once again the fact presented by the scriptures. Christ was handed over to death by one of his disciples, was abandoned by all in his death, to whom he had dedicated himself as an instructor and who had shown appreciation for his teaching and had been considered the Son of God. About the death of Christ. In his next statement, Celso asserts with indescribable folly,
If, after inventing a defense for what is absurd, and therefore deduces ridiculously, or rather imagines that he has really made a good defense, what inhibits him regarding those other individuals who were condemned, and died a miserable death, and were greater and more divine in their role as messengers of the heavens than Jesus?
In this quote, Celso counters what early Christians spoke about regarding Christ and his death as a good defense for the divinity of the Son of God, by asserting that Christ was not the only one to die a miserable death, and was even considered a messenger of the heavens. Celso's point is, if Christ is not unique in these respects, what about the others who went through the same? Celso's questioning, as anti-Christian as it may be, presents details about the death of Christ, as depicted in the scriptures. Christ indeed died a miserable death. Celso does not describe what kind of death this would be in this quote, but he asserts it shortly afterward.
Jesus appeared after his death only with the appearance of the wounds received on the cross, and in fact he was not as wounded as he is described as having been.
In this statement, Celso confirms Jesus' death by crucifixion, although he claims that the wounds Jesus received were only those inflicted by crucifixion, thus denying that any prior torture had occurred. But history still does not give Celso the benefit of the doubt, as floggings were the standard form of torture given to victims before crucifixion. However, it is important to note that Celso contradicts himself again later when he claims that Jesus probably was not even crucified, but rather an impostor died in his place. Once again, Celso seems to have access to different versions of Christ's death, probably coming from Jewish sources. About Christians. After these points, Celso cites some objections against the teachings of Jesus, made by very few individuals considered Christians, not the most intelligent, as he supposes, but rather from the most ignorant class, and asserts that
the rules established by them are as follows, that no educated person should come to us, or one who is prudent or wise, because these qualifications are considered harmful to us. But if there is anyone ignorant, or not intelligent, or uninstructed, or foolish, let them come with confidence. With these words, recognizing that such individuals are worthy of their God, They clearly show that they desire and are capable of overcoming fools, the mediocre, and the stupid, along with women and children.
Although the teaching of Christ and the Christians appears distorted here, it is evident that Celso was surrounded by people who professed a faith that he himself did not approve of and took pleasure in criticizing. It is very likely that the first beatitude of the Sermon on the Mount is the message that Celso possibly satirizes. In a footnote, however, the editor of Origen's text reminds us that not only is the teaching of Christ and the Christians satirized, but the Christian scenario is also presented in a deliberately derogatory manner, as primitive Christianity was formed by people of all social classes, as we saw in Tacitus. What can we say about Celso's statements? Firstly, we must note the critical nature of his work and the great amount of cynicism and contempt with which he presents Christ and the Christians. Secondly, we must realize that even though such criticism is fierce, he presents some details about Christ in line with what is known about him in the Gospels. In light of this, we understand that Celso, with all his anti-Christian fervor, ironically became a good source to demonstrate the historicity of Christ. After all, we do not imagine him writing a book like this about someone who never existed. Talmud. Talmud is the transliteration of the Hebrew word meaning instruction, learning, derived from the root term meaning to teach or to learn. The Talmud consists of two different compilations. First, the collection of quotations dating back to before 200 AD and probably after 70 AD is known as the Mishnah. Second, the production possibly dating after 500 AD, which is known as the Gemara, is nothing more than commentary on the Mishnah. According to Habermas, the Mishnah is the result of an oral Jewish tradition passed down from generation to generation and was organized by themes by Rabbi Akiba before his death in 135 AD. His work was revised by Rabbi Meir. The project was completed around 200 AD by Rabbi Judah. The voluminous body of legal casuistry, the tradition of the elders referred to in the New Testament, had been orally passed down from generation to generation, accumulating more and more over the years. The first step toward the codification of all this material was taken shortly after the fall of Jerusalem. The second step was taken by the great Rabbi Akiba, the first to systematize it according to subjects. After Akiba's heroic death during the failure of the Bar Kokhba revolt against Rome in 135 AD, his disciple Rabbi Meir proceeded with the revision and continued his work. The process of codification was completed around the year 200, thanks to Rabbi Judah, who served as president of the Sanhedrin from 170 to 217. This complete code of religious jurisprudence thus compiled is known by the name Mishnah. Due to the nature of the Mishnah, a Jewish legal compendium compiled by Pharisees, it is not to be expected that many references would be made to Jesus or his followers, as this is not the type of literature for storytelling. However, in the very few references made, either to Christ or to Christians, we find hostile comments that nonetheless serve to attest to the historicity of Jesus. In the Mishnah, in the 43rd section of the Sanhedrin, we find the following statement about Jesus Christ.
On the eve of Passover, they hanged Yeshu, and before that, for 40 days, a herald had proclaimed, "He is to be stoned because he practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Whoever knows anything in his favor, let him come forward and plead on his behalf." But no one came forward in his favor, so they hanged him on the eve of Passover.
The translators and editors of this material into English seem to have no doubt that Yeshu is indeed Jesus Christ, a fact they do not dare to dispute or cast doubt upon regarding the reference made to him. Taking into account all the statements from the Sanhedrin regarding a Yeshu known as being from Nazareth who was hanged on the eve of Passover, in a statement originating from a period very close to the death of Christ, leads us to think that this statement must be about Christ. If this cannot be inferred, we would have to consider that in a period very close to Jesus, another Jesus was hanged and killed on the eve of Passover, which would seem a remarkably uncanny coincidence. Traditional Jewish literature, although mentioning Jesus very rarely, and in any case must be used with caution, supports the gospel claim that he healed and performed miracles, although it attributes such activities to sorcery. Furthermore, it preserves the memory of Jesus as a teacher, saying that he had disciples, 5, and that, at least in the early rabbinic period, not all scholars had concluded that he was a heretic or deceiver. Mara Bar Serapion. Mara bar Serapion was a Stoic philosopher from the Roman province of Syria who became widely known because of a letter he purportedly wrote to his son, also named Serapion, around the year 73 AD. Due to this letter, he became one of the earliest non-Jewish and non-Christian references to Jesus Christ. It was once believed that Mara bar Serapion was a persecuted Christian, an opinion vehemently rejected by more recent scholars. To illustrate the fact that the persecution of wise men leads to misfortune, Mara bar Serapion states,
"What benefit did the Athenians gain by putting Socrates to death? Famine and plague came upon them as a punishment for their crime. What advantage did the men of Samos gain from burning Pythagoras? In a moment their land was covered with sand. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. God justly avenged these three wise men. The Athenians died of hunger, the Samians were overwhelmed by the sea, the Jews, ruined and driven from their land, live in complete dispersion. But Socrates did not die for good, he lived on in the teaching of Plato. Pythagoras did not die for good, he lived on in the statue of Hera. Nor did the wise king die for good, he lived on in the teachings he had given."
Mara bar Serapion's statement is fascinating and equally controversial. The most significant controversy surrounds the identity of the wise king. Is the wise king indeed Jesus Christ? For example, Farrell Till argues that the wise king is Jesus Christ, simply because pretended messiahs were a dime a dozen in Judea. This question is important, and it was to be expected that skeptics would question its veracity as a reference to Jesus Christ. However, we should remember that there are at least 7 statements made by Mara bar Serapion that help us identify the wise king. First, he was executed. Second, he was wise. Third, he was executed shortly before the destruction of Jerusalem. Fourth, his execution predates the dispersal of the Jews. Fifth, the Jews were responsible for his death. Sixth, he still survives through the teachings he left behind. Seventh, he was referred to as a king. Given this, we should inquire which character among the dozens of candidates for Messiah could fit all the characteristics of Mara's wise king. Finally, the last controversy raised by skeptics concerns the fact that Mara bar Serapion attributes the death of Christ to the Jews, which is technically not the most accurate information, as Christ's death occurred at the hands of the Romans. It's impressive that this is indeed a plausible argument to contest the reference to Jesus Christ in this letter. The New Testament is filled with references attributing blame to the Jews, such as Peter's first sermon, for example. Another detail that arises when discussing anti-Semitism in the early church is precisely this fact. In fact, this is one of the pieces of evidence for an older letter, as it is highly likely that Mara bar Serapion was aware of the Christian message of Christ's death as orchestrated by Jews. Interesting video, isn't it? Subscribe to our channel to follow our content, and leave your like on the video. See you next time.